the politically correct culture. Kev, what did you have? Did you have something to throw in before we knit it up for part one?
I think he touched on that mimetic effect and how that relates. I would just throw back to you that so it would sound like any messaging, any artistic expression, encapsulated in story form or for a script for a movie, these would represent an attempt at creating a Platonic ideal to sell people on the idea of one objective reality. Would you agree with that statement? I mean, if realism distinguishes between the mind and nature, and the idealism is more based on kind of one consciousness or the one idea that stands above all creation or all being. So, like movie scripts, and these would be attempts at selling a Platonic ideal. Because looking at it from the perspective of like McLuhan and the idea of trying to get everybody on one page, because if you don't get everybody to speak the same language, then you don't have anybody to bring to the table of an international order, like which is kind of the basis of the liberal international order.
Right. So a lot of people who, obviously in their own thought process or praxis or whatever, they're probably not aware of any ideals or they don't care about Platonic ideals. So it's not like a conscious conspiracy of Platonic idealism, but rather my view is that we always function on the basis of there being abstract universal principles, whether we want them to exist or not. So even if we don't think that there's really a realm of forms or that there is such a thing as universal justice or that there's objective ethical standards or whatever, or artistic standards, it's still inherent in our constitution as human beings to act as if there were. And I think that smarter people in social engineering or whatever, they're aware of this, and they probably don't really care about the abstract question of whether there really is such a thing as an objective standard. They're more concerned with the usage of that idea. And so I think it's Gregory Bateson, for example, that says that the way that you control men is by capturing their imagination. And this would speak to what we're talking about, because the imaginal is that realm of the reflection, the reflections of whatever is objective or perceived to be ideal. So again, set aside what is real, and just for them, yes, it's just the question of manipulation and management of perception, which will always involve some ideal, and they can shift and change that at will to, at one time it might have been a strong male figure or something like this, a patriarchal figure. I'm not saying that was all manipulation, but I'm saying that was a more healthy, natural notion of what's ideal for a guy. And now it's becoming the beta hipster, gender fluid. They're changing this into like a more androgynous notion of what the ideal is.
Well, the ideal is specificity, and what they're doing is making ambiguity more important than specificity and definitions and identification, which rips apart logic at its roots.
This is what the Marxist tactic with language has been, and this is the whole philosophy of altering the language to alter the people and the culture. So the 60 pronouns of the new genders is 100% a cultural Marxist technique and attack to destroy the existing population. Particularly, as we said, what's one of the most fundamental aspects of human being is their sexuality, and that directly relates to reproduction. So if you attack that, destroy that, you're just ensuring that there's not going to be strong males or fertile females in the future. That's how you decrease the population.
Well, and I think attacking logic and reason and education and everything that's come before us is, I'm not saying logic and reason are God, but they're definitely the immune system for the human mind. And when they go in and attack these structures, you can't protect yourself from untruths. And then before you know it, you're the president and you're launching cruise missiles into Syria. But these are things
Kevin mentioned literary theory. I meant to mention that real quick. So Derrida is involved in the deconstruction of language and literary principles and so forth. If you look at Wittgenstein, he writes this whole tractatus about everything being language games. And so he would fit into this category as well. And what he ends this argument with is that his own book is a bunch of language games.
Right.
So it ends in postmodernism. So postmodernism, interesting, you can find connections between Western intelligence agencies, the CIA, directly funding and being involved, not just in the Frankfurt School, but also in postmodernism. They were connected to Foucault, they were connected to funding projects that Derrida worked in. And there are leftist scholars, PhD guys, who've actually, I've posted the article, the guy's name escapes me now, but you could Google CIA connections to Foucault and Derrida, and you'll find that they were interested in French postmodernism and using those ideologies. We've mentioned spies in the academic clothing.
Right.
It's the same idea with taking ideologies as weapons, and it's not. It could be anything. You just want to experiment. You kind of play with these things to see what the effects are. And Foucault is a great example of that.
Well, and that is their kind of magic superpower as these intelligence groups, because it goes from Bertrand Russell and Principia Mathematica, and then kind of handed off. Like Wittgenstein's like, oh, you can write a bunch of BS and symbols that don't really translate to objective reality and be considered the greatest of all time. And that's basically where that comes from. Yeah. So I remember when I was learning about that, I was like, oh, well, it's not like they're really figuring stuff out. They're just creating another mind loop to lose people in. So you just, I can't understand all those symbols, so it's fallacy of authority. These guys must be smart, and let them design our society and create, continue their eugenics plan and controlling of the students' minds through education.
Well, I might have to disagree with you on one aspect of the loop, which would be that I do think that like a Gödel argument for
incompleteness.
That is actually a good argument, and it's actually a sound logical argument that what we call transcendental argumentation or transcendental logic.
That you can't prove this place from within this place. So therefore, there's this whole set of equations no one can solve within this place. That's pretty cool.
I think that's a valid argument, and you can find that argument going back to Aristotle. Aristotle makes that argument against the sophists. The sophists come to him and they say, how can we prove the law of non-contradiction without assuming the law of non-contradiction? How do we know that these laws are true? And Aristotle says, by the impossibility of the contrary. So he says, if we deny these things, you're actually using these laws in the process of denying them. And that's called the transcendental argument.
Right.
So there's no way to argue for that type of a thing without assuming that type of a thing. So strictly speaking, that's not a fallacy of circularity, because the nature of the thing that we're talking about cannot be avoided or spoken about.
Well, it's like an axiom of existence is what you're talking about, because you don't even have to attach words to it. You have to do certain things as a human being to continue living. And no matter what words or belief system you have, these things have to go on.
It's self-evident.
Yeah, self-evident.
Okay, so another example might be words. Like, how do you explain or define words without using words? Well, you can't. I mean, it's just like impossible. So would we say, therefore, that those are stupid questions, or you can't ask those kinds of questions? I would say no, because they're what's called meta logic. They're meta theory questions. And I think they're very real. They're very important. They actually do play into the real world, the real life. They come into things like mathematics and into even computer theory. Will at times use this kind of strange logic, if you will. So in other words, it's not illogical to ask a question of meta logic. And a lot of people that I encounter or have debates with or arguments with, particular certain ones in the past that we're all aware of, they will assume that if you ask that kind of question, you're playing a word game, you're trying to fuck with me, you're trying to trick me and trap me up. I'm saying, no, you can go to Aristotle and you'll find a transcendental argument. That's not fallacy of authority. I'm just saying it's an example of where somebody has used this kind of argument. And if you understand it, I think that it is a solid type of argumentation. It is within the bounds of logic. It may not be within the bounds of normal symbolic logic or typical informal fallacies, but that doesn't mean that it's not still within the bounds of logic. Anyway, that's a big, long, deep, different question. But the reason I bring it up is that, so let's see a practical application of that. When Wittgenstein says words, argumentation and logic is all word games. It's just playing games. So he makes arguments to try to prove an objective point throughout this book. And at the end of the book, he says it's all word games. That would mean his book is word games.
Yeah.
So he's basically, it's like a cartoon sitting on a limb.
Well, I think that's what Hume did too. I mean, some of these other thought experiments, and they're cool to read. I'm just saying, don't necessarily adopt your understanding system before you check out what all these other people had to say, I think there is a path that connects logic and reason with that which exists through our five senses. And things that we're talking about that we can't sense, they're non-sensory. I'm not saying they're nonsense. I'm just saying they're non-sensory, and that's part of the subjective part that makes up every human being. And I think a lot of these philosophical systems take either or, and it's also and.
Yes, that's the problem with Western dialectics. So I totally agree with that. I'm just saying that that what this kind of argumentation, the reason I would bring it up is that it raises the question of whether mathematical or logical entities are in some sense material or in some sense purely human social constructs, or whether they actually exist in an ontological or metaphysical sense. And I very strongly believe that they do have some real existence that is not purely a human social construct or grounded or found within material, quote unquote, reality itself. And that's very important for questions like metalogic or religion or metaphysics. Is there such a thing as metaphysics? Is that all gobbledygook, right? These become very important. Universals, are they real, or is that all just gobbledygook of the Middle Ages? So the trend, and this is one of the problems that I have with a lot of the libertarian approaches, is just that sort of basically it goes back to naive empiricism. So if I'm critical of naive empiricism, I'm not being critical of empirical methodologies, which I totally agree with. So I agree with you, Richard, that yes, logic and objective factual claims do match up to our five senses. But if you go back to people like Hume is useful in that he shows that if you ground all of that in a reductionist sense only to empirical reality, you have all of these very difficult issues that arise in philosophy, and you're going to be naive empiricism is a dead end, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So how do we avoid naive empiricism without, on the other hand, falling into like weird mysticism or some sort of cult or whatever? And that's really what I've tried to work out and been interested in for the course of my philosophical career, is those kinds of questions. And so that's a whole other kind of topic or issue, but that's just a window into kind of why I have problems at times with, like a Kokesh type view or a materialist type view or a strict empiricist type view, is that I think they're dead end philosophies that might raise good questions and might have good criticisms, but do they take us to where we want to go, or are they dead ends? And I think you can logically demonstrate with absolute certainty that strict empiricism, naive empiricism, is a total dead end philosophy.